Hello everyone, it's Old Guardian here. Hearthstone's Europe Winter Playoffs were played last weekend, and I'm here to tell you about the results and the successful archetypes and the successful decks in this high-level tournament. So if you don't like spoilers and if you want to watch the games first, please do that first, because now we're going to take a look into the results of the tournament. First, there were 7 rounds of Swiss, and after that concluded, the top 8 players were divided into 2 GSL style groups. In Group A, Mauri, Casey, Bunnyhopper and Faeli faced off, and the winners to the championships from this group were Faeli and Bunnyhopper. In Group B, it was Viper, Psyhodel, Thunderup and Davido, and Viper and Thunderup managed to qualify for the championship. The core of this video, however, is all about the decks and lineups. So, looking at the lineups of the people who qualified, of these 4 players, 3 players brought this sort of best decks type of approach. Hybrid Hunter, Mind Blast Priest, then a combination of even Paladin Odd Rogue and even Warlock. So 3 of the 4 players had just solid, good decks that are able to apply a lot of pressure. However, that is not the only route to qualify. You can also qualify if you have a really good read on the meta, and Viper did exactly that. He had Odd Warrior, Mind Blast Priest, his own Shudderwock Shaman, this is a fatigue style control shaman deck, and Big Spell Mage. So he was trying to counter all sorts of aggressive pressure and control his way to the championship, and this time it proved successful. It's notable how Viper's lineup is more than the sum of its parts, especially regarding Odd Warrior. Because if you take a look at the general performance of various archetypes in this tournament, I have a table of that performance here, then we can see that Odd Warrior was actually one of the worst performing archetypes in this tournament. Because there was one Odd Warrior in top 4, and that was also the only Odd Warrior that was in any of the lineups that had a 5-2 or better result after the Swiss. 5-2 was the lowest that you could qualify into the top 8 with, and overall there were 19 players who had 5-2 or better record after the Swiss. And in order to be fair to the performance of various archetypes, it makes sense to include all of the 5-2s in the calculations. So while out of the 80 players, 20 players had chosen to bring Odd Warrior, only 1 or 5% of them managed to reach that 5-2 record, which was achieved by 24% of players overall. And you could argue that that was precisely because Viper chose to go with this entire package, which included that fatigue style Shudderwock Shaman. His lineup would have been extremely vulnerable to OTK decks, but there were not that many OTK decks in the tournament, so he had a great read on the metagame. But what do all the other numbers in this table mean? Well, first, there's the top 4 players who qualified and the archetypes that they brought. So from this you can see that everyone who qualified brought Mind Blast Priest. 3 of them brought Hybrid Hunter, there were 2 Odd Rogues, 2 even Warlocks, 2 even Paladins, and then, well, all of these ones are from Viper's lineup: Big Spell Mage, Odd Warrior, Shudderwock Shaman. The next column tells us how many of these archetypes were in lineups that got the 5-2 record or better. Remember, we don't get archetype-specific win rates from Hearthstone tournaments, so we can't say that okay, Mind Blast Priest won this and this many games. That sort of data simply does not exist. It is not collected by the tournament organizer. Therefore, we can only do these indirect statistics. And in 5-2 lineups or better, 9 Mind Blast Priests, 11 Hybrid Hunters, plenty of Odd Rogues and even Warlocks there as well. So these archetypes were clearly getting through. However, it's all not that clear cut, because when you evaluate okay, how many of these archetypes were being brought in successful lineups, you also have to take into account okay, how many of these archetypes were brought into the tournament overall. And here we can for example see that Hybrid Hunter, there were 11 Hybrid Hunters at 5-2 or better, but there were also 48 Hybrid Hunters in the tournament. So naturally, if for example everyone brought a specific archetype, then everyone who would qualify would have that archetype in their lineup. So we're trying to find archetypes that were not brought by everyone, but that had a larger representation at the top than their share of the overall metagame. And the final column of this table is attempting to do exactly that. 24% of players, 19 players, had a record of 5-2 or better. And this column shows the percentage of these archetypes that reached that record. So if this percentage is higher than 24, then the archetype, in theory at least, overperformed. It was more represented at the top than it was at the bottom. Obviously, there can still be many reasons for that. It could be that the archetype itself was so good that it carried that lineup, but it also could be that the lineup itself was somehow very good for the meta, even if an individual archetype in that lineup wasn't particularly strong. Also, as we get into archetypes that were brought by very few players, say those archetypes that were brought by like 2 players. So if Control Warrior was brought by 2 players and one of them made it to 5-2 or better 50%, does this mean that Control Warrior is awesome? Well, not really, we don't have the data. The best conclusions we can draw from this sort of data is from archetypes that were brought by fairly many players and looking at okay, whether these were doing well or not. And from this perspective, for example, Hybrid Hunter 48 brought, 11 at 5-2 or better 23%, which is almost the same as 24%. So Hybrid Hunter was performing around average. Same goes for Odd Rogue, 25%, 23%. These are archetypes that were performing just about the average. Even though they were very highly represented at the top, it doesn't mean that they were actually the ones that were doing the carrying. They were just business as usual. They were getting the job done, but they were not the differentiating factor. That might also mean, in case of something like Hybrid Hunter, which is extremely popular, that Hybrid Hunter was just the given. If you were successful, you had Hybrid Hunter anyway, so further success was determined by something else in the lineup that made a difference. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because we can look at Mind Blast Priest at 29%, Even Warlock at 33%, getting to that 5-2 record. So Mind Blast Priest and Even Warlock were archetypes that were performing better than the average in this particular tournament metagame. Also, one other very interesting observation here is looking at OTK decks, Mechatoon decks in particular. Mechatoon Druid 2 out of 2 into 5-2, Mechatoon Warlock 2 out of 3 into 5-2 or better, and actually the third one was Sirius's very control heavy Warlock, which didn't even run a Cataclysm, so it was just Mechatoon as an alternative win condition in that one. So OTK decks were performing quite well, but this is a very low sample size, so it's difficult to draw conclusions. But still, when we combine the Mechatoon decks together, we can maybe find some kind of indication that there might be some idea in that sort of lineup. So now that we know about the archetypes, then another interesting question of course is, well, what kind of decks were these? Were there major differences in the decks of these particular archetypes? And let's go take a look at that one next. This is perhaps one of the more interesting slides. This is the Mind Blast Priest that qualified. Remember, every player who qualified brought Mind Blast Priest, all 4 of them. But look at this comparison. I've used Hearthstone Top Decks' comparison feature to create this slide, and there are a fair number of differences between these builds. 3 of them are Wild Pyromancer Divine Hymn builds, and there's one Witch Doctor Crowd Roaster build. All of the builds run Holy Fire, which is to be expected in the current metagame, but one thing that really catches my eye is that ThunderUp's build doesn't have any Cabal Shadow Priests, nor does it have the Twilight Acolyte. It goes for Shadower Death, and it goes for Skulking Geist, and it goes for weapon removal and silence instead, choosing this sort of very tech-oriented path instead of the stealing path. This might just go to show how strong Mind Blast Priest is overall, when decks that are so different from each other can all be found in top lineups. When we look into the Hybrid Hunter lists, we don't see quite as much differences. There were 3 Hybrid Hunters at the top, and there's one difference between the decks. Bunny Hopper chose to include a Candle Shot, whereas Faeli and ThunderUp went with an additional secret, a Snipe. So with Hybrid Hunter there seems to be a high level of agreement on the appropriate deck list. It becomes more difficult to draw any conclusions when in top 4 we have only 2 copies of some kind of deck, like for example Odd Rogue. Well, Odd Rogue is what Odd Rogue is, and then there are a couple of deck slots, and these players had chosen different deck cards for those slots. Faeli going for Void Ripper and Greenskin, whereas ThunderUp went for Scalebane and Snapjaw's Shellfighter, which is a really interesting tech card, protection against board clears. The Even Warlocks at the very top looked pretty similar. Bunny Hopper had a no tech cards on 6 approach, whereas ThunderUp had chosen to include a Skulking Geist. The top 4 even paladins differed a little bit. Bunnyhopper brought a Valanier build with double Avenging Wrath, whereas Faeli didn't use Valanier. He also didn't use the Spirit, but he had an Argent Commander instead and only 1 copy of Avenging Wrath. However, undoubtedly the most talked about deck in the tournament is this one. This is Viper's Fatigue Shudderwock Shaman, or Peanut Shaman as he calls it. And this is a deck that has been crafted for tournament play. It's a fatigue deck, it goes for a very, very long game. It has tons of removal, it has tons and tons of value, with spent cards coming back again and again with Kragwa and with Shudderwock. And if you watch the games, this deck really grinded out the opponent slowly, methodologically, into the fatigue. Obviously, a deck like this has some glaring weaknesses. If you were to face, say, OTK Paladin or a Mechatoon deck, you would simply die. There's absolutely no way this type of deck can beat those OTK decks. But Viper had a really solid read on the tournament meta, and he didn't expect OTK lineups. And there were only a couple of OTK lineups, both of which reached 5-2 record by the way, but they didn't end up getting on Viper's way. You can find the deck code of this deck in the description, and you can also find a link to Hearthstone Top Decks. The Hearthstone Top Decks has all the decks from the tournament, so if you're interested in any of the others, you can go on their site and check them out. Next weekend the championship tour continues. It will be the Americas Winter Playoffs, and it will be interesting to see how the meta will change for that tournament. Stay tuned for news about that one. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please click the like button and subscribe to my channel for more.